Ticonderoga, 1960. Hi, Mike. How was your flying lesson?
Well, I didn't break anything, and Sam soloed me today.
Hooray for you! Congratulations! This calls for a celebration. Dinner is on me, and it's steak night, shall we?
Lead on, Captain. Good evening, Georgie.
Good evening, boys. You're looking cheery tonight. What mischief have you been up to?
Mike soloed Sam's cub today.
That's wonderful, Mike. Congratulations. Does that mean we have a new puking dog among us?
Hardly, Georgie, but it is a proud and happy day for me, even though I still have a long way to go to earn my private pilot license and glider rating.
Please join the celebration with us at dinner, Georgie.
Thank you, Captain. I'd love to, but I've already eaten and there's an issue in the kitchen to tend to.
Uh-oh, not the health department again, I hope.
Very funny, Captain. Just a minor adjustment for a new employee. Perhaps I'll join you for dessert if that's okay.
Later, in the lounge.
Well, Captain, whatever the issue in the kitchen was, it sure didn't affect the food. Who would ever expect beef Wellington for dinner at a retirement home?
True, Mike, but this isn't the ordinary old farts farm, you know. Thanks to Georgie. I'm glad she joined us for dessert. That's rare. I think she has eyes for you, my boy. What do you say to that?
Very flattering, but I doubt it. She is such a gracious, intelligent, and charming woman with everyone, it would be hard to tell.
So I take it you are not ruling out the possibility?
If I were one to rule out possibilities, I wouldn't be here, would I, Captain? I'll just see where my yellow brick road goes.
Well said, Mike. Shall we pick up with the 1960 Ticonderoga cruise?
The recorder is on, Captain.
As I said, I joined Air Wing 5 as the replacement staff LSO following the arresting wire brake accident, which put Carlos Font in the hospital with a shattered left knee, grounding him for a year and a half. The Air Wing had been aboard Tico for initial workups for a brief period of day flight ops when the accident occurred, so I arrived just in time for the beginning of night operations. It was quite an exciting challenge for me as an LSO, since I had not controlled any of the Air Wing aircraft types except Demons, day or night, and the pilots were strangers to me. At the same time, I'm sure the pilots, the Air Wing commander, and Ticonderoga's captain had reservations about my lack of experience, not to mention concerns about the arresting gear. Nevertheless, I am thankful to say that all went well and without incident. Although I was assigned to the staff, I was attached to the Demon Squadron, the VF-53 Pukin Dogs, for flying purposes.
How did the Pukin Dogs react to having a staffee thrust on them to share flight time?
Thankfully, everyone was very welcoming. I wasn't a total stranger since I had been an instructor and LSO with some of them in VF-121. Plus, I had as many Demon flight hours and carrier landings as most of them. Fortunately, my Air Wing administrative duties were light, so I was able to spend time hanging out with the dogs and came to feel included. The best measure of it was that I ended up the cruise with as many flight hours and carrier landings as anyone in the squadron.
How were you able to get away from the LSO platform to fly?
From the beginning, I was determined that I would not be indispensable. So with my boss, CAG Salty Moore's blessing, each squadron was required to have a qualified LSO and another one in training. Surprisingly, it wasn't as hard to recruit volunteers as I expected, once they believed it wouldn't interfere with flying and they were relieved of other administrative collateral duties. We were soon up and running with a merry band of paddles. If there was something special about Carrier Aviators Society, there was extra camaraderie among LSOs. There were usually 4 to 8 of us on the platform during recoveries, and it became a social center where the competition was to gross each other out with the most vile jokes ever told. There was also a myth, which some claimed was true, that LSOs once competed with each other in two-wire derbies in the days when LSOs signaled a cut with the paddles to tell tail-dragger prop pilots to cut throttle and flare his touchdown to get the tail wheel on deck for the tail hook arresting wire engagement. It was a mark of expertise for an LSO to cut an airplane for a particular wire because of deviations in airspeed, altitude, deck motion, and pilot technique. The only prop tail draggers remaining in my time were the AD Skyraider squadrons, so it was a special treat to wave them aboard and give them a cut signal with the green lights on top of the mirror. Anyway, the story went that LSOs sometimes competed to see who could cut the most airplanes to the number 2 arresting wire, the two-wire derby. The winning LSO's prize, they say, was that he got to bed the other LSO's wife. "Hi, honey, I'm home. I lost again." All pilots were welcome to visit the platform to see what landings look like from our view, and it made believers of them. I was alone on the platform one afternoon when Salty Moore appeared and offered to write my comments in our record book. The first airplane was a big A3D, which came aboard a little left of centerline, putting its left wingtip a few feet above our heads. There wasn't anything especially dangerous or unusual about it, so I didn't think much of ducking my head as it passed. When I looked back at CAG, he was white as a sheet. He handed the book back to me, left the platform without a word, and never returned.
What were the demon driver puking dogs like?
The 1960 VF-53 dogs were an interesting and unusual combination of naval aviators. The skipper, Johnny Johnson, was a good man, though overweight, a somewhat weak aviator, and an ineffective hands-off leader. He owned a liquor store in Coronado and consumed a fair portion of the product. His wife died giving birth to their 6th child, and he made the 6 o'clock news by marrying a widow with 6 children. He was a great dad, apparently, and a compassionate man. Because of his girth and his happy hour behavior, he was affectionately known to the dogs as Buddha. In contrast, his executive officer, Claude McCullough, was a short, skinny, feisty, insulting renegade who enjoyed denigrating everyone. Humor to him, but not to us when we couldn't return the sarcasms to a senior. Number 3 dog, Gib Kirk, the operations officer, was an aggressive and dangerously overconfident aviator. In his mind, he was the acting commanding officer and a hotshot pilot. Claude and Gib both disliked LSOs because they believed they did not need our help. The effect of this fractional leadership void on the other 11 dogs was that they banded together, probably in a way similar to Buddha's children, to become the most interesting group of individualist aviators I ever knew. Unlike what you would expect of a fighter squadron, however, the flying was mostly routine, straight and level, at relatively low speed, to save fuel for getting back aboard. Since our all-weather interceptor mission was performed single place, single engine, and single plane, there was little operational team unity. We flew little formation, aerobatics, or dogfights with each other, so there was not much overt camaraderie either.
It doesn't sound much different than flying AJs, Captain.
It wasn't. The greatest difference was our pulse rate and blood pressure during night carrier approaches. Although Demons looked relatively stable and steady on the glide slope, if you watched the elevator and ailerons during the approach, it was obvious that there was a lot of pumping and thrashing of the controls going on, which contributed to the high 25% demon bolter rate. Ron Hess, my good dog friend and fellow LSO, aptly likened it to killing snakes in the cockpit. My marginal eyesight didn't help me either. I could not define the mirror's meatball well enough to tell me whether I was above or below glide slope until late in the approach. I was 5 years away from wearing glasses.
Good grief, Captain. How did you get through it?
Fortunately, Ron was meticulously analytical about demon carrier approaches. He found that the large indicator near the top of the instrument panel for engine exhaust nozzle position permitted ready reference for small throttle changes. He also worked out the glide slope geometry. At 1.25 miles from the ship at 1,000 feet altitude, we could establish a 600 feet per minute rate of descent, which would keep us in the ballpark on the glide slope. So I was able to focus more attention on cockpit instruments for the first half of the approach. Remember, Mike, on dark nights at sea, far from lights ashore, there are no outside visual cues for pilots to judge altitude, attitude, closure speed, nose position, depth perception, or rate of descent, except cockpit instruments, 3 lines of landing area lights, and the mirror's meatball glide slope indicator did not provide sensitive indications to deviations until close in. Orientation required a combination of flying on outside visual contact and cockpit instruments, which Ron termed construments, which was very conducive to inducing vertigo. We were still years away from electronic glide slope indicators, white floodlighting of the landing area, auto throttle, or the automatic carrier landing system. Carrier commanders still operated with the World War II mentality of minimizing lights and electronic emissions to evade detection. During some exercises, aircraft made navigation lights off approaches, and LSOs were not permitted use of the radio except in emergencies. Those nights were quite challenging on the LSO platform.
If you couldn't see well what you were doing in the cockpit, as an LSO, how were you able to tell what approaching airplanes were doing?
That was another LSO mystique. You see, there was a degree of mild fiction between pilots' egos and LSOs. It goes against the grain for aviators having someone tell them how to fly and criticize their mistakes. During debriefings, pilots often denied the LSO's observations of pilots' mistakes and declared that LSOs were all blind. For a while, I wore a white flight suit, dark glasses, and a sailing hat, carrying my guitar case in one hand and once a red-tipped cane in the other, tapping my way down the flight deck to the LSO platform before recoveries. Little did they know how blind I really was.
Tell me about Ron Hess, Captain.
That's not easy, Mike. Ron was so uniquely eccentric that I couldn't do him justice. He came into the Navy as a NAVCAD, Naval Aviation Cadet. That is, he had only 2 years of college. However, he more than made up for the other 2 years with a thorough self-education. Earlier, he had apparently been a hard-drinking, motorcycle-riding, hell-raising bachelor. But that changed dramatically when he married the love of his life, Joanne, who was quite tall, thin, and plain. Ron had been in love with Joanne since high school, but she married someone else and had 2 children before her divorce and marriage to Ron. I have never known a man as devotedly in love or happily committed to his marriage. Yet he kept his motorcycle, and their only car was an MG sports car. His fighter pilot instincts remained undiminished, yet his domestication knew no bounds. Lawn care, for example. Ron decided he was not going to have ordinary grass, so he got a Department of Agriculture manual for Ticonderoga lawns, bought the seed, chemicals, and special soil, and rented a cement mixer to stir up the concoction. He had the most beautiful dichondra lawn in San Diego for a few years, until an untreatable fungus attacked the roots and killed it all. Ron loved flying and was a consummate, nearly compulsive professional, but family separation on cruises was difficult for him. At sea, he was gregarious and humorous, but in port, he was a reclusive loner. One of the few times I saw him ashore, he was sitting silently alone at the bar in the Yokosuka Officers Club, nursing a drink. I saw the depth of his feelings displayed only once, in a most surprising and uncharacteristic outburst. While we were in Hawaii, Buddha had one of his bouts of heavy drinking on Waikiki Beach, which had been reported in someone's letter home and circulated among the wives. Of course, the code demanded that what happened ashore on cruises stayed there. So, Claude assembled us all in the ready room to chew our asses out. As usual, and unfortunately, he said it the wrong way, blaming "you pussies who write home every day." In a flash, Ron leapt from his chair in a rage, declaring that he was one of those pussies and would not stand for being derided for it or blamed for the event. Claude, of course, was not a big enough man to accept this justified angry response, so Ron probably suffered for Claude's well-earned humiliation in his subsequent fitness report. As I said, Ron's outburst was uncharacteristic. He was mainly known for his odd sense of humor and observations about life. He coined, "Men are led through life by their penis." Another was, "Indecision is the key to flexibility," and vice versa. The one I liked most was, "Don't fade into the woodwork. Let 'em know you were there." I'll think of others as we go along. Ron created a fictitious pilot in the squadron, Ensign Wicker Clegan. On his initial radio call on Glide Slope, Taproom 102, Ball, State 22, Ron added, "Pilot Clegan." Then Ensign Clegan's name was added to the Ready Room roster board, as well as administrative lists and routing slips. Our very young and naive intelligence officer, Ensign Bob Hoffman, also known as Bobby Blue's Eyes, thanks to Ron, spent his time in the intelligence spaces and rarely visited Ready Room 1. One day, however, he was the squadron duty officer during a man overboard drill. Of paramount importance was to determine if someone was actually missing, so all hands quickly assembled in assigned places for an accurate personnel accounting. "Where's Clegan?" Ron asked Bobby Blue Eyes. "Better call his room. He probably slept through the alarm." "No answer," said Bobby. By then, Bobby was very nervous, so of course everyone piled on. "You'd better call the bridge right away, Bobby, and report Clegan missing." So he did, and shortly after came the announcement from the bridge on the LMC. "Now hear this. Ensign Clegan report to Ready Room 1 on the double." Everyone except Bobby and the captain's bridge team appreciated the humor, and Ensign Wicker Clegan achieved everlasting puke and dog fame. Ron and I were together as LSOs for 6 years. He had more influence on my outlook than anyone I have known. Hardly a day passes without recalling something he said.
You speak of Ron in past tense. I assume he is not living?
No, he isn't, but he was in and out of my life for another 10 years. So I'll get to that. Now is a good time to relate a composite picture of pre-Vietnam life in the Philippines at the old QB Officers Club, which you'll recall was essentially nothing more than a screened-in bamboo shack with a thatch roof over iron pipes. However, The view of primitive Subic Bay and the high surrounding mountains was spectacular. The QB Club was popular because it was close to the Carrier Pier, and the atmosphere was especially relaxed and informal. Since there was no air conditioning, the dress code was casual, coats and ties not required. Since crime and social disease was rampant in the primitive town of Olongapo outside the gate, many didn't venture off base, and so the QB Club was one of the few places where squadrons socialized together. Aviators invariably lean or hang on to anything handy, and it is said that an Irishman or fighter pilot is never drunk as long as he can hold on to a single blade of grass and not fall off the face of the earth. Therefore, those pipe rafters were irresistible to hanging upside down from them by the knees like bats. It takes some practice to down a drink that way, Mike, but many accomplished it with great finesse. Following happy hour, squadrons often assembled in the dining room at long pushed-together tables. Sometimes, less experienced junior officers were not able to remain conscious through the meal. So following the meal, they were selected to be the airplane for a little fun called cat shots and arrested landings. Besides airplane, others were selected to be the catapult officer, landing signal officer, and arresting gear officer. The stronger and more sober were selected as 2 wing officers and 2 engine officers to provide the needed aerodynamic thrust and lift to airplane for flight. Seeing what was coming, the waiters would quickly attempt to clear away the dishes, silverware, and glasses from the flight deck, but not always successfully in time for the first launch. The semi-conscious airplane was then taxied into position face down on the flight deck with his wings and landing gear spread, and with a wing officer and engine officer on each side holding on to the airplane's wings and landing gear, ready for the catapult officer's launch signal when airplane was fired down the flight deck with remaining tablecloths and dinnerware scattered to the ocean, and airplane flown around the pattern by the wing and engine officers. Sometimes, sadly, airplane would get a cold shot and would leave the flight deck without lift or thrust provided by the wing and engine officers, and would join the debris in the ocean, only to become once again airborne thanks to the renewed thrust and lift of the wing and engine officers to continue around the pattern for a carrier approach and arrested landing under the control of the landing signal officer, who gave the cut signal to the engine and wing officers, who then ceased to provide lift or thrust to airplane. Sadly again, airplane would sometimes land short and have a ramp strike. Or on other occasions, the arresting gear officer failed to engage airplane's hook, and they would bolt her off the end of the flight deck into the ocean. Needless to say, all of this good fun was very valuable training for young junior officers in teaching them to pace their drinking properly at happy hour. This little game, however, was becoming a regularly disruptive and destructive event, not to mention dangerous, and had to be stopped somehow. The solution was an ingenious mechanical contraption to replace the tables. I'll describe later. On one of those QB Club evenings, Buddha exhibited the finest leadership display of surviving overindulgence ever witnessed. We expected him to pass out before dinner. Instead, Buddha seemed to go into a meditative trance. His glazed eyes stared into another world. His sweaty, puffy face was oblivious to his environment, and he spoke only to order the largest T-bone steak. After dinner, we adjourned to the main room, leaving Buddha behind, totally detached from the task of gnawing on his steak, for the floor show native ladies in folk costume were performing the Philippine national dance, Tinikling. The dance, which originated from a form of punishment for slow farm workers during the Spanish conquest, consisted of clapping together two large bamboo poles against the workers' ankles. Today, the dance is performed on Sundays by women in colorful native costumes and bare feet, dancing to the slowly increasing tempo of percussion and string instruments. 4 men on the ends of 2 pairs of 10-foot, 4 to 6-inch diameter bamboo poles crossed as in tic-tac-toe, kept time by beating them against the floor and clapping them against each other in a complex rhythm. The graceful Tinikling dancers in colorful, flowing costumes imitated the movement of the tickling birds walking between grass stems, branches, or dodging bamboo traps. The rhythm began slowly, and dance steps seemed fairly simple, as the ladies delicately withdrew their feet in time to avoid injury by the heavy clapping poles. By the end of the dance, the beat was so fast, it was hard to see how the dancers were able to step out of the way in time. After the performance, the audience was encouraged to give the dance a try. This is no small feat, pardon the pun, which an inebriated aviator should not attempt, for the pole men do not always take pity on fools like us. I describe all this in detail to you, Mike, to set the stage for what happened next. From the sidelines to stage center came the mighty Buddha, walking unsteadily and clutching the remains of his T-bone in his greasy hand with pieces of fat attached, as 4 beautiful young girls positioned and steadied him between the poles. There he was, our fearless Pukin dog leader, eyes glazed, face soaked with sweat and grease, as the music began and the men kept the beginning slow beat with the poles against the floor. Buddha made no effort to raise a foot as the poles came together the first time against his ankles from 4 sides. Amazingly, there was no physical sign of pain in his expression, or even a blink in his far-off stare. His only reaction was to raise his T-bone to get a mouthful of fat. And so the Tinikling dance continued, as the mighty Buddha just stood motionless, except for gnawing on his T-bone, with no change of expression, as his ankles were pummeled by the poles in increasing tempo, until several dogs decided it was time to bail Buddha out. To my knowledge, none of the letter-writing pussies ever wrote home about the incident, and the subject never came up in the ready room. Apparently, Buddha had no injury or memory of the event. The permanently stationed officers at QB Point, however, took great exception to the rafter-hanging dining room games and inebriation at their club. In an effort to upgrade the decorum, the dress code was changed to require coat and tie, or uniform of the day, after 5 p.m. Needless to say, arbitrarily requiring dress-ups at an unair-conditioned grass shack in the tropics did not sit well with us and accomplished nothing to modify behavior except to raise the level of animosity and noise. One afternoon, a Marine helicopter squadron assembled in working uniform for happy hour. When they remained past 5 p.m., one of the base officers reminded the Marine CO of the dress code. When the Marines failed to comply, the unhappy base officer called the officer of the day. Lo and behold, the OOD was in working uniform too. Tropical white shorts instead of the long trousers of the uniform of the day. Instead of leaving as requested, the Marine CO took his pants off, as did the rest of his men, so their underwear matched the OOD's shorts. The Marine CO led the OOD to the door and advised him to close the club to more patrons, and the Marines had the place to themselves for the rest of the evening without consequence. On another evening, the bar was closed early to dampen our behavior, so one of us called the base CO, who earned a prominent place in naval aviator history by coming to the club in his bathrobe, reopening the bar, and drinking with the boys until daybreak. I am proud to report that CO later made admiral. In the end, though, many decided that if we had to dress up, we may as well take our act to the much nicer and more formal Family Officers Club at Subic, or the small informal club with a swimming pool at the family housing area. The QB Club missed our business, and the other club's patrons were, to say the least, unhappy with our presence. The situation came to a head when a group of young aviators formed a Christmas choir to sing a very foul X-rated version of the 12 Days of Christmas at the QB Club. Encouraged by their popularity and the Christmas spirit, the choir took their show on the road to all the clubs, including the Chiefs and enlisted clubs. Shortly after, the QB dress code was dropped and life returned to normal. Still, a few of the QB base officers continued to be poor sports about our behavior. One evening after happy hour and dinner, a local lieutenant took great exception to Duck Huey's inebriated behavior. The lieutenant lost his temper, and Duck took his gestures as a physical threat and punched him out. Unfortunately, however, Duck forgot that he had a beer bottle in that hand and smashed it across the lieutenant's face with bloody results. For some weeks after, court-martial charges were pending against Duck. Fortunately, largely because of the lieutenant's own aggressive behavior and unpopularity with his superiors, the charges were dropped. A few years later, the ultimate solution was to tear down the QB Club and replace it with the most hideous and non-functional officers' club in U.S. military history. Nevertheless, the tradition of cat shots and arrested landings was occasionally preserved in the dining room by new junior officers, until a dirty shirt annex was built in back of the club with a mechanical contraption with a chair on inclined rails next to a pool of water. The rails were fitted with an arresting wire, and the chair was fitted with an arresting hook dropped by the chair's rider. There was an adjustable ramp which caused the hook to skip the wire if dropped too soon, allowing the chair and rider to continue into the pool. At least that's the way it was described to me. I never saw it, because most old-timers ever after shunned the new QB-O Club in favor of the Subic O Club.
And you say that shore leave was not especially colorful, Captain? I cannot imagine it getting much more rowdy than that.
I suppose you're right. Compared to the life of an Albuquerque attorney, Too bad. I once read a book written by a World War II flight surgeon titled Flying Health, in which he made a strong case for the benefits of happy hour in relieving the tensions of regularly facing death in the air. Perhaps that's where the tradition originated. One excuse is as good as another. Everyone needs some way to relax from the pressures of life. Honestly, though, I was never an enthusiastic participant. My father was a teetotaler who often said that the only person who can stand a drunk is another drunk. Since in his eyes everyone drank, he was antisocial. I suspect he swore off because he distrusted himself. Perhaps it rubbed off on me. It probably would have benefited both father and me if we had learned to lighten up more in our lives. After all, moderation in all things does not imply being an antisocial teetotaler, does it?
No, but I have seen a few teetotalers talked into drinking and realized what a mistake it was. Still, that doesn't justify their judgmental wrath against those who can handle social drinking properly. There are times and places like the old QBO club, as you described it, where it may serve a beneficial purpose, especially when alcohol consumption aboard ships is against Navy regs, right?
True, it's against regulations, however, not always strictly observed. I'll get into that more later.
So, what was shore leave like at other ports, Captain?
In Japan, we tied up at the old Jap Navy base in Yokosuka on the western shore of Tokyo Bay, south of Yokohama, where Hornet docked in '58. It was protected by close-in rocky hills, which had been extensively tunneled with workshops and storage facilities. Like most things in Japan, the base was in miniature, but very well done. The routine for these port calls was much the same every time I visited there, so they tend to run together in some ways. For that matter, so do the cruises. So I'll recall events that stand out in memory without too much regard for chronology. If we were to be in port in Yokosuka for an extended period of yard work on the carrier, the air wing was flown ashore to NAS Atsugi so we could maintain flying proficiency. One of those fly-offs was memorable. Because of a late shore basing decision, we were catapulted off Ticonderoga after we tied up to the pier in Yokosuka. It was quite a sight and damn noisy with us in afterburner in that confined space. I know of no other time where demons were catapulted off a carrier while docked in port. One night at the Atsugi Officers Club happy hour, Buddha, in a mellow mood, agreed to let 4 of us fly demons on a weekend cross-country. When Gib Kirk heard about us going over, around, and behind him for permission, he was furious. Not only at us for asking, but at Buddha for agreeing, because we were due to fly back to the ship the following Monday, and Gib was sure that we would have 4 demons down for maintenance, scattered at USAF bases all over Japan Monday morning. To punish us, embarrass Buddha by making sure we would have maintenance problems, precluding Monday's return to Ticonderoga, Gib demanded that we fly 2 legs a day to different bases. To Gib's great chagrin, we returned without a single maintenance gripe on any of the 4 demons. To this day, Smoke Wilson, Kirby Wells, Roger Harris, and I are remembered as Hack Flight.
What does HAAC mean?
House arrest and confinement. The non-judicial punishment of an officer being confined to his stateroom by his CO. Happily, Hack Flight was only confined to flying demons for 3 days.
Was there some similarity between the Atsugi and QBO clubs then?
None. We didn't hang out together much there, because there was nothing primitive or threatening about being off base in Japan. On the contrary, I felt that the Japanese were most culturally refined. Though theirs was a relatively closed society, the people were very tolerant, honorable, and polite to us. Whether aboard ship in port or shore-based, however, normal working hours were maintained. After all, we weren't on vacation, and the burden of collateral administrative duties never slowed. Unlike the city of Yokosuka, with all its bars, clubs, and shops catering to the Navy, Atsugi was very rural and quiet. So we generally teamed up in taxis or trains from there for shopping trips to Yokohama. It was a pretty tame life, really, but nonetheless interesting for our glimpses of Japanese life and culture.
Okay, Captain, so much for the tour. How about your personal nightlife on that cruise? After the positive experience of the previous cruise, weren't you hoping for another?
No, Mike, you'll recall that I wasn't looking for action before either. This cruise was no different. Nevertheless, stuff happens, doesn't it? We had 2 first-tour flight surgeons with us who expressed an interest in seeing what Yokosuka nightlife was like. So I took them to the ex-Jap Navy Officers Club in town, which I described before. When we agreed to have girls join us, there were only 2. That was fine with me, so I indicated that they should sit with the docks. Then one of the girls said she had a girlfriend visiting from Tokyo who worked at the world-famous Queen Bee nightclub, and that she might like to join us if it was okay, but that she could not speak a word of English. Okay with me, I was just showing the doctors around town. Nabucco was very tall, thin, and lovely. These ladies were unusual in that they were wearing street clothes and were not as interested in the usual bar conversations or drinks. Instead, they were more intent on having a conversation in Japanese among themselves, like a group of wives out for lunch. Not that it was annoying, just unusual. When their conversation became more animated, and it was apparent that they were discussing us, I asked what they were talking about. They explained that the girl from Tokyo was a virgin, and they had agreed it was time to change that condition, and that they were debating which of us would be best for her first time. They had settled on me.
The Yellow Brick Road again, Captain?
Most assuredly. Here I was, nearly 30 years old, being asked to deflower my first virgin, in Japan of all places. I ask you, Mike, how else does something like that happen? What else could a poor boy do?
Of course, I sympathize totally, but first virgin? What about Aurelie?
Yeah, right. We'll get to that question one day. One story at a time, all right?
Sure, so what can you say about how it went?
Awkward, but not too badly, considering that we 2 strangers, with no common language or attraction, there alone in the darkness of a strange room, with no furniture except a bed on the floor, for the prescribed clinical purpose of a first-time induction. It helped that she was in her mid to late 20s, not a silly teenager, and that she was Japanese. In Japan, sex isn't complicated by sin, religion, morality, scorn, or laws. It is simply a highly accepted body function fact of life. Unlike American women who tended in those days to sacrifice themselves on the altar of marriage and knew little of the subject, Japanese women were very curious and well informed of sex. Besides, I was skeptical about her virginity. Anywhere in the Orient or the rest of the world, it surely had to be a very rare event indeed to be asked by a lovely mature woman to deflower her. Yellow Brick Road, you ask? Absolutely and undoubtedly. Anyhow, without going into intimate detail, the obstruction was real, and there was so much pain and bleeding for her, she asked to stop. There was no doubt about her virginity, unless she had some very elaborate way of staging it. So we took a break, and she soon asked to try again. It worked out just fine all around, and we became an item for a while. Nobuko became insatiable and demanding. When I was at my limits, she wanted more, and knew how to get it. I reckon she read all the right books. There were just two problems: her drinking and her sister. Her reaction to booze was an unpredictably violent temperament. Unfortunately, it turns out that the private, as opposed to public, behavior of the Japanese is quite like all other humans worldwide. Her older sister had a child and was married to a black sailor in the U.S. who had abandoned her. She became a problem because she was constantly with us and expected me to fix her up with someone. This was not a cherished role for me, especially since she shared the drinking and insatiability tendencies of her younger sister. One night around 3 a.m., the sister barged into our room, taking a flying leap into bed with us. Nobuko didn't seem too upset about it, so it occurred to me that I was expected to take care of Sis too. Well, Mike, it may be most men's fantasy to have two sisters in the sack at once, but I guess something in my psyche put me off. I took Sis to her room and deposited in her own bed alone, and explained to Nobuko that we were not to be a threesome any longer, in any sense of the word. It all finally ended when Nobuko, under the influence, attacked me one night. In the end, I learned a lot about universal female behavior, and it was not a joyful experience. Nobuko was an anomaly, but at least I learned to be less idealistic about encounters in the Orient. Nothing in life is all black or white, Mike. For me, my compromise was the best choice I could live with in the real world. Although I have no regrets, there was a corner in my religious beliefs which acknowledged guilt. I was well aware of the pitfall of the morally corrosive consequences. In my mind, in the end of those days, the only commandment I hadn't broken was coveting thy neighbor's wife, which I dearly clung to avoiding. As you will see later, that conscience nearly did me in.
What about other port calls? Did your own butterfly rule apply to those?
Yes, no more than one flower per cruise. The only other port was Hong Kong, which we normally visited only once each cruise for 5 or 6 days for a frenzy of intensive duty-free shopping for goods from all over the world, including cars and yachts. Especially in the 50s and early 60s, Hong Kong was a most fascinating, exotic Asian city. It was a wide-open, free trade, duty-free port with the best of Indian tailors and goods from everywhere on earth at truly bargain prices. Some called it Sampan Frisco because of its geographic similarity as well as its cosmopolitan character. It was a unique mix of the total spectrum of Chinese and British colonial culture in those days. Steaming into port, it was usual for a junk or sampan to cut across our bow as close to collision as possible to cut the tail of the dragon, which represented death to them. As soon as we dropped anchor, we were surrounded by dozens of sampans alongside to paint the carrier's topsides from stem to stern with long rollers, as well as water and garbage barges to tend to our needs. Other sampans plied goods for sale to the crew. The harbor was strewn with trash, garbage, and animal remains, sometimes human. Behind the glitter, life was cheap and survival difficult. Nevertheless, the people were industrious, hardworking, and honest. Literally thousands of refugees from mainland China were pouring into the territory daily, and the Brits quickly constructed dozens of high-rise resettlement apartment buildings to try to keep up with the flood of humanity. Still, some chose to live on sidewalks, starving and begging for work, too proud to accept government welfare. In contrast, nightlife was like a pajama party for the many gorgeous teenage girls working at the bars, nightclubs, and dance halls. Very unlike Japan, however, those customers who escorted these ladies home at 3 a.m. typically discovered that groups of girls shared apartments who also had their escorts present. So then the cards came out, and a bundle lost playing poker until dawn, when our hungover, discouraged, exhausted, and broke heroes made their retreat back to the ship. I knew of no successes in those quests, so I stuck to the tailors and some of the world's finest Chinese, Indian, and British restaurants to be found anywhere.
You haven't said much about the flying this cruise. Considering the usual hazards, plus the Demon's engine unreliability, are there no scary episodes to relate?
Oh, sure, a couple of them. We lost 2 Demons to compressor stall engine failures and pilot ejections at sea. Fortunately, both pilots were rescued uninjured. The first was on a squadron fly-off to Atsugi, Japan. Since we were to be ashore for several weeks and there was no luggage space in Demons, we consolidated our clothes, cameras, golf clubs, etc. in the single blivet we had, which was a purpose-converted external fuel tank hung on a bomb rack. So, of course, you will quickly guess correctly which engine failed and dumped the Demon with blivet into the deep Atlantic Ocean. Ironically, the pilot was Ron Miller, the squadron's aircraft maintenance officer.
How appropriately deserving, Captain. Was the second loss colorful also?
Much more so, and couldn't have happened to another more appropriate victim. Gib Kirk was climbing out after launch, passing through a low cloud layer, when his engine went into compressor stall, with the usual flames shooting out both ends, resulting in engine shutdown. Since Gib was above the clouds and wished to be spotted by the rescuers, he turned downwind to beam the ship and glided below the clouds before ejecting. The launch was still in progress, and I was on the LSO platform for the following recovery, near the 4A1 Sky Raiders tuned up, awaiting deck launch. Gib's Demon was gliding silently and majestically on its own, in a slight turn, as though in the landing pattern, downwind abeam, making a landing approach. Who would ever have imagined that an engineless Demon could glide so beautifully? Surely it couldn't glide and guide itself all the way to the ship. Well, it was making a credible attempt, which caused considerable alarm to all, especially the anxiously observing tied-down Sky Raiders pilots, helplessly strapped into their cockpits, engines running, props turning.
I expect you quickly lost interest in witnessing the outcome and left the scene?
Lord, no. How many lifetimes would one have to live to witness a scene like this? A Demon with no canopy, engine, or pilot, silently guiding itself in a near-perfect carrier landing approach.
Obviously then, since you are here to tell the tale that did not happen.
But it very damn near did, gliding 100 feet astern at flight deck level across our wake and splashing down gracefully and disappearing into the deep blue sea.
Didn't Ticonderoga's CO have a few things to say to Gib? This doesn't seem to be an event left undiscussed.
Gib was admonished for putting the ship in harm's way, but it was hard to argue with success. As my granny said, a miss is as good as a mile. Or as the Marine Corps says, close only counts in horseshoes, hand grenades, and nuclear weapons, as was the case in my closest call. I had a case of food poisoning one morning with a severe bellyache. I felt a little better after vomiting and went to bed. I didn't mention it to anyone since I was scheduled for a night flight. By the time briefing time came around, I felt well enough to make the flight. Wrong. I got violently sick halfway through and barely got my oxygen mask off in time to throw up all over the cockpit. I felt so awful that I could barely fly the airplane, so I turned over the lead to my wingman, Irv Astor, as we headed for the approach Marshall Point at 20,000 feet, which happened to be in the middle of a thunderstorm and contributed to Irv getting totally disoriented with vertigo. Let me tell you, Mike, it's a challenge to fly an airplane in a nighttime thunderstorm on the wing of an aviator experiencing vertigo in lightning and heavy turbulence while puking. And guess what? It got worse. The recovery was delayed because of rain at the ship, and we were going to be low on fuel. It was every naval aviator's dream of a night carrier landing. Low fuel, storm, rain, rough seas, and vomit in an airplane with a 25% chance of missing the arresting wires. And it got worse. Bless his heart, Irv dove for the deck and bent his nose gear fork so badly that he was unable to taxi out of the landing area. So I had to go around while they attached a tow bar and tractor to drag him out of the way, leaving me with only enough fuel for one pass. If I didn't get aboard on my first try, I was going to have to eject. In these seas and rain, there was less than a 50% chance of being rescued.
It terrifies me to hear it. How does an aviator cope with fear and nausea in such dire straits, Captain?
At such times, you're too busy to reflect on fear. There's only one good way out of these events. Concentrate on the task at hand. Looking back now, I marvel that I was able to get through it. But the only consequence was getting my butt chewed for flying sick. Bless the plane captain who had to clean up the mess in the cockpit. I left them.
Amazing. You were truly lucky, weren't you?
Some would say providentially protected, Mike.
Well, Captain, it's getting late. Is there anything else to say about that 1961 Ticonderoga cruise before we wind up this chapter?
Just two anecdotes about the homecoming fly-off to home bases. As the staffee, I was assigned the Hangar Queen, a demon which had been grounded for maintenance for months, but had been patched together well enough for a one-time flight home. I was on the port catapult against the holdback with the throttle up when I saw that the safety pin indicator on the right wing showed that the wing was not locked in the spread position and might fold up after launch, leaving my sorry ass in a very embarrassing situation. Airplanes do not fly at all well with one wing folded. After frantically signaling the catapult officer with a thumbs down and got him to suspend the launch, a maintenance man climbed up on the wing and was finally able to stomp the pin down with the heel of his shoe. So off I went, and the wings remained spread. Unfortunately, that was not quite the end of the cruise. A friend, fellow LSO, and Skyraider pilot, Ray Agee, collided with another Skyraider on formation join-up and took the prop through his cockpit. It was not a cheerful homecoming on the ramp at Miramar for us to inform Ray's waiting widow and children that Daddy wasn't coming home after all.
I'm beginning to understand what you meant by cruises being completely apart from your domestic life ashore. It must be very difficult indeed to shift gears at homecoming.
Yes, Mike, mixed emotions for all concerned. So, let's call it a night and resume in the morning. I'm going to skip breakfast. I'll meet you at 10 at our spot at the end of the yellow brick path. Okay?
See you then, Captain. Good night.